We are live. Okay. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Everyone here. Everyone who's tuned in online. Today was a unique day on the Jewish calendar. It was the 10th of the Jewish month of Tevet, which is a fast day. So Jews around the world abstain today from eating and drinking. And it commemorates the beginning of the destruction of the temple. The history around the destruction of the temple is fascinating. It's worth reading up on. The first temple in particular, and it took over a number of years where slowly the Babylonians, led by Nebuchadnezzar, came in. They first overpowered the Assyrians and took over the whole region. And then on this day, 10th of Tevet, they laid siege on Jerusalem. Only 2.5 years later that they actually destroyed the temple. But the beginning, the foundation for destruction was already laid. And so all the events surrounding the destruction, we commemorate today as days of mourning, days of national reflection. And so this day in particular is a day of reflection of the destruction. Interestingly, although it's only the very beginning of the destruction, the siege, people weren't necessarily threatened, there weren't lives lost, or there were, but it wasn't the most terrible part of the destruction. In a certain sense, it's the most stringent of all of the fast days, even more than Tisha B'Av, which actually commemorates the destruction of the temple. It comes out, expresses itself in a very technical aspect of Jewish law, but it shows in something of the theme of the day. And just briefly, if usually the fast day comes out on the calendar on a Shabbat, we push it off to the next day and we fast on Sunday. So Tisha B'Av will be on Shabbat, the 9th of Av. We won't fast. The celebration of Shabbat overpowers the day of Tisha B'Av, and we don't want to ruin our Shabbat, so we would fast the next day on Sunday, the 10th of Av. The exception is Yom Kippur, obviously, because it's biblical, and it's also considered a kind of Shabbat. And the 10th of Tevet, this fast of today. Now, the way our calendar is organized, it's impossible. The 10th of Tevet will never fall on Shabbat, which is an amazing, calculation. They managed to do that to avoid this issue. But were it technically, theoretically, to fall on Shabbat, we would fast. So this is considered so important, even more than Tisha B'Av. And the reason is because once the foundation crumbles, it's only a matter of time for the building to fall. So in the very beginning, the seeds were already planted for the destruction. It was too late, and it was already on a path. This is where it all began. In fact, later on, the king was Tzidkiah, and he came to the prophet Jeremiah, and he says, help me out over here. He said, it's too late. The decree has already been made from God. He did give him a way out. He says, if you make peace with the Babylonians, which he didn't listen to, and ended up being bad for him and the Jewish people. But essentially, this is the day where it all happened. So something I've been thinking about on this day, and it's something I think is very relevant, is the Jewish people, this is the first time they were exiled, right? From when they became a nation, this is the first time where they lost their autonomy, where no longer did they have their own leader, a king to be in charge of them. They weren't in charge of their own land, didn't have their own government, and they were exiled from Israel. So this is over 800 years since they entered Israel. So for a long period of time, as they became a nation, they lived in this sense of comfort. They were a nation like all the nations, a nationality, a country, with a government, with a king, with a ruler. And now for the first time they were facing exile, facing dispersion. What's going to be the Jewish people? Are they going to survive? And this is a question which was on the top of their minds. So Jeremiah encouraged the people in Babylonia, don't worry, continue life as regular, have children, go to work, eat, drink. And he told them it's only going to be 70 years. In 70 years we will return to Israel. And indeed, 70 years later, a contingency of Jews, those that wanted to. Many didn't, but they went back to Israel and eventually rebuilt the temple. But when the destruction of the second temple came, they didn't have that luxury. There was no prophet telling them anything. And the Talmud records something fascinating. Rabbi Yishmael, one of the great sages, who in fact himself sat in prison as a child in Roman prison. He said, once these Romans have come into power, this is right post-destruction of Second Temple, so in the first century. He said, once these Romans have come to power, decreed against us these terrible things, not allowing us to practice our Judaism, we should stop having children. Our children aren't going to be able to have a bris. Our children aren't going to be able to perform mitzvahs freely. Judaism is going to be lost to assimilation, to forced assimilation. Let's rather stop it ourselves. Naturally, stop procreating. That, he said, he entertained the idea that should be an appropriate response to the destruction. We've lost our autonomy in Israel. We're under a foreign rule that's not only isn't accepting of Judaism, but is actually, pushing Judaism away. It's over. Let's end it on our terms. And Talmud says the only reason we're not going to do this is because no one's going to listen. He says we have a rule that the rabbis never enact a ruling or a decree unless they think majority of people are going to follow. Otherwise, it's a lost cause. We're not going to tell people what we think is right if they're not going to listen. They should rather do something wrong unwittingly than to rebel against the authority. But think about it. Put yourself in their shoes. They really thought Judaism, which had been there for 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, this religion, this family, this heritage, is all over. And they had reason to think that. But we have the advantage of hindsight, and we're here 2,000 years later. We're a thriving community. Around the world, Jews are not a huge percentage of the population, but we have a significant amount of Jews, strong Jewish communities that are still practicing the same traditions as our ancestors back then. So what has allowed us, what led to us being around till today? What's the secret? I saw today an article from 1989 in the New York Times. The Dalai Lama was on a trip to New York, and part of his trip, he had a meeting with rabbis. I think a group of 6 rabbis he met with. And they had a 3-hour meeting, discussion of, I'm sure, all kinds of interesting things. But one of the most pressing things in his mind that he wanted to find out from these rabbis is what's the Jewish secret? Remember, the Tibetans and the Dalai Lama were in exile from the communist government in China. And he wanted to know, how can we continue, maintain our traditions, our integrity of our group in exile in a foreign place where we're not under our own autonomy? And he said, who better to ask than the Jews? We've got it. We somehow have this secret sauce. We've managed to make it happen, make it work. And the question is what that secret is. What has allowed Judaism to continue till today? Any ideas? Purpose, okay.
Make this a dwelling place for Hashem. You can never give that. Stop doing that. You got to always try. You could always, like the Rebbe used to say, you could always turn. And I think the mitzvahs too. Like purpose, to make this a dwelling place for Hashem, and the mitzvahs.
So you have a very specific purpose, which is expressed in a very specific way of practice.
And also not, as far as I know, like Buddhism, they can get maybe have ulterior motives for enlightenment, or I'm not positive, I don't want to speak out of, but like there's nirvana, there's enlightenment, that could border on spiritual narcissism. Judaism's like, this world counts. It's not an illusion. I mean, maybe you don't, make it a home for God. So it reveres here. It's not just some place to come to get off the wheel of reincarnation like Buddhism. So there's a little more, no duality, like it's connected.
So we have a purpose in this world, and that's true. The question is, though, we live in a society that is very distant from that, even antithetical to that mission, right? And we've gone through persecution, we've gone through societies of very secular culture or very enlightened, and we haven't lost that way. The question is, yes, we have a very strong purpose and a strong sense of mission, but is that enough to maintain? Is that enough to be able to continue the traditions and that we're still here?
We have a book.
We have a book. Okay. Every religion does, right? Okay. Anyone else have any insight?
Actually, I think part of it is that we don't proselytize, and so we have to. First of all, we don't have necessarily the issue of converts who may not be very committed, or may not be, or may even be hostile to your values. And then it also meant that we had to focus on the base, on the people who are already Jews, instead of other religions that are just thinking about new followers all the time.
Okay, so Judaism had a strong focus on the base. Okay, I mean there has been a lot of conversions historically. You're right, we don't go out and seek them, but there is definitely a conversion process and idea in Judaism.
Well, I think what benefits it is that it's so hard to convert to Judaism.
Okay,
You can
weed out
weed out the people who you can walk into a church and become baptized and become a Catholic in literally days. But it definitely weeds out people who wouldn't be. I read about the process recently. I knew somebody who was converting to Judaism to marry a Jewish girl, and if he were a Jew converting to Catholicism, it would take him literally a couple of days. But for him, he's been studying, for literally almost a year, and he doesn't think he's ready. So
it's definitely a process.
So he just wouldn't do that if he weren't committed.
Right, that's true. But even so, that there are people that are committed to this, generation after generation, despite not being in an environment of this ideals and behavior, is an amazing thing. And the question is, historically, how has it been maintained? But I think the question also more relevant for us. In our own lives, how do we stay on track? It's in the short term and the long term. In the short term, the question is, how do we keep focused? We know we have a mission, we have a sense of goal. How do I make sure that I don't get influenced? And in the long term, how do we stay on a certain path, and our children should be on that path? And what's the way to ensure this direction maintains itself? The very first people to face this crisis, to face this challenge, I don't know who the very first people were.
Jacob?
Well, Jacob to a degree.
In Egypt.
But once Jacob started a family, which became the Jewish nation, it was his son Joseph, who was distant from the family. He was in a foreign land, in Egypt, a land which Torah describes as being morally depraved. And he had no connection with his family. He lost touch with them for 20 years. He was in an environment which was hostile to him. He was a slave, then a prisoner, and eventually rose to power. So then he was in a position definitely to be influenced by what's going on, to get to his head. Yet he remained strong. He remained a son of Jacob. And more significantly, it was his children. Joseph had 2 sons born to him whilst he was in Egypt, away from his family. Manasseh and Ephraim. And when Jacob eventually meets up with Joseph towards the end of his life, and he sees his two children. He's, obviously emotionally taken back. This is beautiful. I never thought I'd see Joseph, let alone grandchildren from him. But he tells the children something fascinating towards the end of his life. He's blessing his children, Jacob's children, 12 tribes. But before he blesses them, he blesses his grandchildren, Menashe and Ephraim. And he tells them something which we still repeat till today. He says, in the future, when parents bless their children, they're going to bless their children using you as a paradigm. The children should be as successful as Menashe and Ephraim. And in fact, the blessing we say today, we bless our children. Some say it every Shabbat, some right before Yom Kippur. This unique text of the blessing we give our children. And the text reads, Yisimcha Elokim, God should make you, should bless you to be as successful as Ephraim u'ke Menashe, like Ephraim and Menashe. Of all the biblical characters, we know little about them. Ephraim and Menashe. Abraham. Bless your children, be like Isaac, they're Jacob. So many greats. Ephraim and Menashe, these two children, little known, grandsons of Jacob. But because they were the poster children for diaspora Jews, for Jews born in exile, they were the first ones from birth to live in a hostile environment and remain faithful, hold strong to their belief, hold strong to their sense of family, of community, of being part of this nation, being part of this family of Jacob. And so Ephraim and Menashe become the paradigms of what we want our children to be. And of course, whatever we want our children to be, what we really want to be. Right? We project. But how we should be living and what we want to bless our children, we're looking to Ephraim and Menashe. Whatever they managed to do, they made it, they were successful, that's exactly what we want our children to be. Now this applies both from a religious level. We want our children to remain faithful Jews, not to be assimilated, not to be lost to statistics, but also as people. That someone should have the strength, the inner strength and courage, not to be pushed around by the winds of society, is the biggest blessing you can give them. Right? If you have a child, as the child grows older, there's more and more worry of that influence. But even as a young kid, his friends, this culture, so many things flashing at him or her that can pull them in all sorts of directions, most of them unhealthy. Right? And the only thing you can do, you can pray that your child remains strong in who they are. No one should convince them to do things they don't want to do or they shouldn't want to do. No one should lead them to dangerous behaviors, and they should live a life of integrity. That's the biggest blessing. So Menashe and Ephraim they managed to do that. The question is how, right? It doesn't answer the question, or does it further the question? Okay, they were the first ones, but we can use them as a paradigm. If we look at what they stood for, who they were as people, that can inform us of what the secret source that Judaism has to be able to remain here.
I was thinking that the history of the Jews that we connected with, these two did not have the benefit of the history of oppression, you're saying, right? They just were the first.
Okay. It's made it harder for them, easier.
Harder.
Yeah.
Much.
You're right. They know one to lean on, right? We can be inspired by grandparents, great-grandparents who went through more challenges than we go through and yet remain strong. We have precedents. We have, things that can guide us. We have Menashe and Ephraim to guide us. They didn't have them, right? Absolutely. Being the first is always the hardest. So even more so, we can see if they managed to do it. What was it about them that they managed to? So in this week's Torah reading, we have a fascinating little episode. The battery's going to die on this, so people online are going to miss out. Lucky you came here, you see? Should we have a charger in this room? The white charger there. There's a fascinating episode we have in this week's Torah reading. When Yaakov comes to bless his grandchildren, the first thing he asks, Joseph says, "Who are these kids?" He says, "My children." Oh, as if he didn't know. Which is a curious little conversation. The Talmud says Joseph produced a family tree in his ksuba. This is all kosher. I promise you, they're Jews. Didn't marry up. It should be a long wire. The outlet's down there. I don't know. Is the outlet here? Oh, here's the outlet here, Sean. We still need the long wire. There's a long wire there. Sorry.
It's an iPad or an Android?
iPad. So, Yosef is setting his children up now to be blessed. And he knows his blessing is significant. Remember, there's a history of blessings in the Torah. We've discussed some of them. Abraham received from God the greatest blessing. Whoever you bless will be blessed. So this is the blessing of, sort of becoming the future Jew. He bequeathed that blessing to Isaac, and not to Ishmael. Then Isaac had the whole politics. Yaakov stole the blessings from Esav, so we see how precious these blessings were. Almost led to Yaakov being killed by his brother. And Yaakov went to such extreme lengths of deception to get them. So these blessings which are being handed down generation to generation weren't just, a blessing we say, Misha Berach, and you should be blessed. This is something real, significant. And Yaakov is now passing his blessings to his grandchildren, Menashe and Ephraim, and Yosef senses the greatness of the moment, and he puts his children in a very specific formation. Menashe is the older son. He puts him to the right of Yaakov. And Ephraim, I don't know where it is. Ephraim, it's not going to reach. I don't know. Ephraim, who's the younger one, he puts him to the left. So Yaakov's left hand will be there. So that way, right hand is always seen to be the more significant hand. So the greater blessing will go to the older son. And the weaker blessing, the lesser blessing, to the younger son. Yaakov was already by now an old man. And what he does is, he switches his hands. He puts his right hand on top of Ephraim's head, and his left hand on top of Menashe's head. And Joseph sees this, he thinks his father's making a mistake. Obviously, he doesn't recognize his grandkids. The old grandparents, what's your name again?
Right.
So, he had 12 sons. Imagine how many grandkids he had, right? So Yosef says, "No, Dad, you're making a mistake. This is Ephraim, he's the younger one. This is Menashe, he's the older one." And Yaakov says, "I know, my son, I know. This was no mistake. But this younger one is going to be greater. And therefore, he's going to get the blessings of the right hand." Now, remember, Yaakov knew the risks of switching blessings around. He knew the implications. He himself was a product of this, right? The younger one taking the blessings from the older one and what it led to. But yet, he felt this is imperative. He has to give these greater blessings to Ephraim, the younger child, because he's destined for greatness over Menashe. And Joseph backs off, accepts, and he gives him the blessings. Now, we don't know specifically what blessing he gave each one. We know he gave the right hand, so the more strong, more significant, more potent blessings to Ephraim. This whole scenario is curious, because Joseph also had insight and prophetic insight. And he felt Menashe should be the one getting the greater blessings. And Yaakov felt that no, Ephraim. So what did Joseph know that Jacob didn't know? What did Jacob know that Joseph didn't know? It seems that each one had a reason to believe they were right. So even though Jacob won out at the end, he gave the blessings to Ephraim, Joseph had a legitimate reason why Menashe should get the blessings. being the firstborn wasn't just an accident. He happened to be born first. Everything's exact. If he's the firstborn means he has something going for him, that he has some advantage over Ephraim. But yet, apparently, Ephraim had some advantage over Manasseh. So, what was going on here? And it's a very beautiful teaching from the Lubavitcher Rebbe that explains this whole scenario. If we first zoom out a little bit, who were Manasseh and Ephraim? And we can understand their character, we'll know what this debate between Joseph and Jacob was. Names are always important, especially biblical names, because today most of us are named after someone. So I'm personally named after my grandfather's brother. Most of you will know who you're named after, where your name comes from: a grandparent, uncle, a favorite person, a friend. And we name after people, which is also significant. It's the name you carry says a lot about you. According to the Kabbalists, your name is a reflection of your soul. And so just by knowing your name, I can know something about you. It tells a story about you. Nothing's by chance. But the biblical names were even more so, because people's names were individualized. They were named after events surrounding their birth. They were named after meaning of the character, and not just after a different person. So every name meant something about the person. And so when a parent or someone else named a child in the Bible, that name reflected the character, personality, and life struggles, soul type of that child. So the names that Joseph gave his children reflected their character, reflected what they stood for, who they were as people. And we're told why he named them, and both of them were given his circumstance in Egypt. The word Manasseh means to forget. Nashani. And Joseph says, I'm living here in Egypt, and I'm forgetting the house of my father. So it's a recognition of an environment that's hostile to where he comes from, to the home of his father, to his traditions. And really it's a protest against that hostile environment, because the first step to protesting that is recognizing it, right? So it's a recognition that I don't belong here. Recognition that this place is causing me to forget who I am. That's Manasseh's name. Ephraim comes from the word lifrot, to bear fruit, to succeed, to thrive. And Joseph said, I'm calling this child Ephraim, Ki Hefrani Elokim. God has made me successful. God has allowed me to thrive in this foreign country of Egypt. So if we think about it, the two names actually reflect opposite sides of the coin. Manasseh is highlighting